Alright guys, little confession, this video has nothing at all to do with the Star Wars films. No. Okay, right, no. Alright, I'm not talking about Star Wars, but I am talking about this bizarre little chapter in Cold War history, which I think you guys are going to find pretty interesting. Okay, so the Strategic Defense Initiative, which would later come to be known by its nickname of Star Wars, was this proposal by the Reagan administration to create a system of satellites which could shoot lasers at approaching nuclear missiles and destroy them in mid-flight. Obviously, this plan is absolutely bloody nuts, hence why it got the nickname that it did. However, unlike similarly crazy plans throughout history, this one not only had a remarkable impact on the actual Cold War, but it also had a big impact on the relationship between the USA and its NATO allies, particularly on the usually close relationship between Ronald Reagan and the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. So why did SDI cause Ronald Reagan such a foreign affairs headache? Why was Mrs. Thatcher so opposed, and how did it lead to the USSR reconsidering their nuclear arsenals? This is the story of how an idea seemingly rooted in sci-fi would lead to a very real treaty on nuclear disarmament. So before I begin, this is Wyvo Joe. It's a channel where I talk about news, history, politics, current affairs and things like that. If that's your cup of tea, which I assume it is because you're here, why not click subscribe in the box below and ring the bell so you know the next time I post a video. That sounded really aggressive. This topic was brought to my attention by Richard Aldous' book on Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan's relationship, particularly on the way that these two butted heads over foreign policy issues. This is not a narrative that people often see explored, obviously because economically these two were very close and they were known to have a very close personal relationship as well, with Margaret Thatcher describing them as being a good team who shared the same analysis of the way that the world worked. However, nonetheless, the interests of the UK and the USA would often lead to disputes over foreign policy. Part of this tension came from the fact that Britain still saw itself as a nation of influence, particularly within NATO. However, they were completely reliant on the Americans for their nuclear deterrent. For example, in the Aldous book, he writes that when the Americans were phasing out the C4 missiles, they gave Britain D5 ones instead. Now, these were a little bit more expensive and they weren't technically necessary for the security needs of the British, but as Aldous sums it up, it was a choice between not having a nuclear deterrent at all and having a nuclear deterrent that fit with the needs of the Americans a bit more than the British one. Now, Thatcher thought it was integral to uphold a nuclear arsenal to maintain British security. However, she couldn't afford to develop one of her own, and therefore she was reliant on the goodwill of Reagan's administration to uphold it. Reagan's idea for a strategic defence programme was announced in a televised address on the 23rd of March 1983.
My advisors, including in particular the Joint Chiefs of Staff, have underscored the necessity to break out of a future that relies solely on offensive retaliation for our security. What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies? I know this is a formidable technical task, one that may not be accomplished before the end of this century. Yet current technology has attained a level of sophistication where it's reasonable for us to begin this effort. I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
I think that a reduction or removal of nuclear weapons was the primary aim of SDI, and I'm not really someone who buys into the whole idea that Reagan was attempting to bankrupt the Soviets. Now, of course, there is a logic to this. According to Soviet estimates, 63% of the money spent on machine building was going towards weapons. And it's also true that Gorbachevs foreign minister said that the reason that the US and the USSR were going into negotiations was that the Soviets could not remain a militarized state. But I don't think this really proves that Reagan was attempting to bankrupt the Soviets, so much as it proves that the Soviets were doing a pretty good job of it themselves. And I also think that this argument completely undercuts and dismisses Reagan's deep hatred of nuclear weapons, but of course I think that might be because it's quite contrary to the usually hawkish nature of his foreign policy. Reagan was not a big fan of détente, which was sort of the main Cold War policy at the time. Détente essentially just meant a period of relaxation between the communist countries and the countries of NATO, and it had pretty much been in place since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, since Cuba nearly destroyed the world, people pretty much thought that Reagan stopping détente was his way of trying to escalate and destroy the Soviet Union, but I just believe that he genuinely didn't think that détente worked. In his announcement about SCI, he said that Russia had far many nuclear missiles than America did, and some academics disagree over whether this is actually true, but no one disagrees that he actually definitely thought that the Soviets were in a better position. Also, it's fair to say that détente wasn't really working anyway, and the tensions were already pretty high, because part of the Soviet arsenal were mid-range missiles which were aiming at London and Paris, and they'd also deployed some SS-20 missiles in Europe. Reagan's response to the SS-20 missiles was pretty confrontational. He didn't like nuclear freezes. He said that even if you could negotiate it and verify it, it would stop the United States from making strategic modernization, and it would keep the Soviets at an advantage. Instead, what he proposed was a 0-0 policy, which was essentially tit for tat. If the Russians didn't remove their SS-20 missiles, the United States would deploy some of their own. However, there was a shift in doctrine in the Republican Party, and they wanted to move from mutually assured destruction to mutually assured survival, and Reagan pretty pithily summed this up himself, saying that MAD is madness. Reagan spoke about nuclear abolition 150 times throughout his presidency, but he knew, like Francis J. Gavin said, that states typically don't give up weapons that they believe protect their national security or advance their strategic interests. And also, because he thought the Soviets had a much bigger nuclear arsenal than the Americans, he thought that it would be unwise to disarm unilaterally. As such, what Reagan proposed was a policy called peace through strength. Peace through strength was essentially the idea that if the Americans had a strong force, it would stop other forces from threatening them. And they also said that they had to restore military balance to get the Soviets to the negotiating table. Now, the idea of military balance instead of military superiority is extremely important here, as when one side has a military advantage in a nuclear war, this is obviously just going to make anxieties even higher than they already were. But this is one of the reasons why Reagan wanted to share SDI with the Soviets, so then that way it would just be a complete military balance. However, this idea of technology sharing, along with the general idea of nuclear disarmament, did not sit well with Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher liked the idea of SDI from the perspective of a scientist, but she didn't share Reagan's vision for a nuclear-free world. Thatcher saw MAD as the bedrock of British security, and also because the British deterrent was linked to the American one, she knew that if the Americans gave theirs away, it would mean that the British would have to develop their own, which they didn't have the money to match to the Soviets. Even worse, if Reagan gave the SDI technology to the Russians, she feared that this may free them up for a conventional war in Europe. Jane M.O. Sharp writes that because NATO relied on America for their security, this made them vulnerable to feelings of entrapment and abandonment, and these were only made worse by Star Wars. They feared that Star Wars would create a fortress America without any further strategic interest in Western Europe, and this would therefore leave Europe vulnerable to Soviet nuclear missiles, especially if the Soviets had their own defensive system, which could undermine British and French deterrents. NATO also worried that SDI created a big advantage for the Americans, which might provoke the Soviet fears of a first strike, and this idea was not totally unfounded. Gorbachev's foreign minister had said that the idea that the Americans would share their technology or let Russians into the lab to look at it was, not really trusted in Russia, and therefore it didn't really seem like a real proposal. As well as this, the Russians absolutely hated SDI. They thought it undermined the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. The ABM Treaty was essentially in place to stop either side from building nuclear missile defences. The logic behind this was that if mutually assured destruction would prevent a nuclear war from happening, anything less than mutually assured destruction might increase the chances of it, but I am sort of going past the Europeans, so let's just head back to them. The Americans tried to get the Europeans on side through economic means by letting them know that some of their $26 billion of research may well go into European tech firms. Obviously, the Europeans warmed to this idea a little, but it wasn't exactly a stable line of support. An essay at the time points out that even though the Americans had said that this new system would boost their economy in terms of the military and in terms of consumer markets, this just wasn't true at all, because there was no way to apply SDI to the consumer markets of the USA, and you're hardly going to see Apple come out with a home defensive missile system. Thatcher supported SDI, but only from a technological and economic perspective. She still couldn't be convinced of its military benefits. At a Camp David summit between herself and Reagan officials, she tried to convince Reagan that he shouldn't go back on a deterrent which had stopped both nuclear war and conventional war. Reagan promised that he wouldn't in return for public support from Thatcher for this strategic defence initiative. However, he went back on his promise in his second inauguration speech.
We're not just discussing limits on a further increase of nuclear weapons. We seek instead to reduce their number. We seek the total elimination one day of nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. For decades, we and the Soviets have lived under the threat of mutual assured destruction. If either resorted to the use of nuclear weapons, the other could retaliate and destroy the one who had started it. Is there either logic or morality in believing that if one side threatens to kill tens of millions of our people, our only recourse is to threaten killing tens of millions of theirs?
In response, Thatcher got herself a speech in front of a joint session of Congress which Reagan happily complied to. During the speech, she remained on her best behaviour and... No, she didn't. She actually undermined the entire idea of SDI in front of everyone.
Mr. Speaker, wars are not caused by the build-up of weapons. They are caused when an aggressor believes he can achieve his objectives at an acceptable price. Our task is to see the potential aggressors from whatever quarter understand plainly that the capacity and the resolve of the West would deny them victory in war, and that the price they would pay would be intolerable. That is the basis of deterrence. Our task is not only to prevent nuclear war, but to prevent conventional war as well.
Reagan wasn't best pleased by this, and insult was only added to injury when Thatcher's Foreign Secretary Jeffrey Howell described SDI as the new Maginot Line. The Maginot Line being the failed fortifications that didn't stop Nazi Germany from getting into France in the Second World War. And Thatcher, according to Aldous, continues to harangue Reagan, saying in a private meeting that if we follow this disarmament to its logical conclusion, surely we expose a massive conventional imbalance which we have to then pump up at our own great expense. And Reagan, he's clearly had enough of her at this point. He looks her straight in the eye and he says, yes, that's exactly what we had in mind. But Thatcher would do something else which would redeem her slightly in the eyes of this story. She convinced Gorbachev that not only could the USSR not win a renewed arms race, but that Reagan was never going to give up the Strategic Defence Initiative. Now, Aldous makes it pretty clear that it's quite likely Thatcher actually thought she could get Reagan to give up SDI, in the same way that she thought that she could get Deng Xiaoping to give up Hong Kong, but nonetheless Thatcher stood firm by her NATO allies and made Gorbachev come to the table with remarkable concessions because of their new strong negotiating position. Gorbachev enforced a 6-month ban on deploying INF bombs in Europe, and he proposed to Reagan also to have a 6-month ban on weapons testing. When Reagan turned it down, Gorbachev did it himself unilaterally. This led to the talks in Geneva in 1985, where, although not much was achieved, they sort of established some diplomatic relations, they agreed to accelerate an INF treaty, and they also essentially agreed in principle to the idea that a nuclear war can never be won, and therefore it must never be fought. This led to further diplomatic talks in Reykjavik in 1986. Gorbachev came to the table with the idea of a 50% reduction in all nuclear weapons. However, the caveat for this was a freeze on all space strike weapons, such as obviously the Star Wars program. Reagan refused to do this, but neither the Americans nor the Russians could actually agree on what weapons they'd reduce if they did come to a deal. The Americans wanted to target the Russian ICBMs, and the Russians wanted to target the American bombers. Essentially, both sides were just going for places where the other one had a strategic advantage. Gorbachev basically pointed this out, saying that the Americans have made no serious efforts to meet them halfway, and it was very difficult to do business this way. And Reagan was, just as damning about the whole process, saying we can either rely on Soviet promises or we can rely on American technology. He said both of them have their own track record, so I know which one I'm going to bet on. This would lead to a resumption on détente on terms which were more comfortable for the Allies. Despite their disagreement over SDI, Reagan and Gorbachev in 1987 would sign the INF Treaty. According to Rosenau, this seemed unimpressive at the time because it affected less than 1/20th of the world's nuclear weapons, but it was still extremely important because this was the first time that the two great powers had agreed to destroy an entire class of nuclear weapons. Of course, Reagan would leave office in 1989, and so the SDI would never be completed, but we can see how the positive characteristics of himself, Thatcher and Gorbachev led to this unprecedented arms agreement. So I don't think that SDI would have ever actually worked, but I think that Reagan's single-mindedness about it definitely produced results. A lot of people could say that if he wasn't so wedded to the idea, then maybe he would have gotten a better deal at Reykjavik, but I think this makes the bold assumption that total nuclear treaties work in the first place. The US and USSR already had a treaty dating back to the 70s, however, nuclear stockpiles had continued to grow. In contrast, the INF Treaty had reduced nuclear missiles by 3,000 units by 1991, and this never would have happened if Reagan hadn't shown the strength by sticking to SDI and if the Russians hadn't feared a US strategic advantage. According to Aldous, the agreement on the table at Reykjavik was a 50% reduction in nuclear missiles with an aim to reduce all nuclear missiles to zero in 10 years' time. However, this 10-year time frame was just, a spoken agreement, and it relied on not only both the Russians and the Americans keeping their promise, but them convincing Britain, France and China to get rid of their nuclear arsenals as well. Therefore, it doesn't surprise me that Reagan stuck to what he saw as a sure bet through the Star Wars programme. Just as a side note as well, Geoffrey Howe, the Thatcher foreign minister, would later point out that it was a supreme irony that the only thing that saved the British nuclear deterrent was the fact that Reagan was so wedded to SDI when Thatcher thought that would be the thing that destroyed it. However, despite my affinity for Reagan's strategy, it's hard not to point out that this agreement was reached because of three people with very different views of world peace. And even though it was strength that got them to the negotiating table, the thing that actually made the deal was them sitting down, going through the details and making a compromise that took them one baby step closer to world peace. Thank you so much for watching. As I said, this is Wyvo Joe, where I talk about, news, politics, history, current affairs, things like that. If that's your cup of tea, which I assume it is because you're here, click subscribe in the box below and ring the bell as well. And then you can, oh my God, and then you can see the next time I upload a video. Off to the right is one of the last videos I did, if you guys are interested in seeing that as well. And now I think I need to take the dog for a walk. For a walk. Do you want to walk? Do you want to walk? Yeah?